What 60s group had the longest string of hits between 1961 and 1971? I'll give you a hint. It wasn't the Beatles. It was Paul Revere and the Raiders. We're going to follow their bumpy ride here on Pop Goes the 60s. Formed in Boise, Idaho in 1958, a young Mark Lindsay joined Paul Revere Dick in his band, the Downbeats. Now, the Downbeats were just a typical rock band. Lindsay was a singer, and Paul Revere Dick played organ. And Mark started taking saxophone lessons to add that instrument to the band's repertoire. By 1960, they started recording some of their songs in a small studio in Idaho, and they started hawking these recordings around, and they were signed to the small Gardena label. The Downbeats was the name they were going by, and when somebody at the label found out Paul's middle name was Revere, they said, "We've got to use that in your name." So they came up with Paul Revere and the Night Riders. And Revere never wanted to use his name. He just didn't want to do it, and they hated the Night Riders. But one of the things that was happening at the time was the new American Football League, and Oakland had a team called the Raiders. So that figured into the new name, and they became Paul Revere and the Raiders. Paul Revere and the Raiders was mostly an instrumental band, but they did vocals as well, and Lindsay did all the rousing vocals. And at this point, there really wasn't a leader in the band, even though Paul Revere's name was in the name of the band. He was not really the leader, and they had a pretty democratic approach to making their music.
My children, and are you gonna hear about the midnight ride of Paul Revere? He had a hopped up motorcycle and mighty hot.
Like Long Hair was an instrumental released in 1961, and it charted. It got to number 38 on the Billboard chart. But the only problem is even though they released an album which didn't chart, Paul Revere got drafted, and instead of going into the regular army, he claimed status of conscientious objector, and he wound up as a cook in a mental institution. So the band carried on without him. Filling in on organ was a young Leon Russell. By the summer of '62, Revere had returned, and they relocated to Portland, Oregon. And this is where they started to really make their mark. They were contacted by DJ Roger Hart, who's also a dance promoter, and he began to manage them. Up to this point, there was a lot of members in and out of the band, and another guy that joined at this point was Mike Smith. He was the drummer, and he was going to be one of the mainstays. They were the biggest band in the Northwest at this time, and there was a very big rock and roll scene. Other bands that were big at the time were the Kingsmen, the Sonics, and the Wailers. Now, of those bands, Paul Revere and the Raiders were easily the most popular band in the Pacific Northwest. And one of the things that gave this area a lot more visibility was the song Louie Louie. Now, you've probably heard the story of the song by the Kingsmen. That song was actually recorded the same week by Paul Revere and the Raiders in the same studio. And there was not really a race to get it out there because the Raiders were the bigger band, and they were outselling the Kingsmen 10-1. But the problem is they had signed to Columbia Records in Los Angeles, and Mitch Miller was the A&R guy, and he did not like rock and roll. So he was they were pushing, Doris Day and Miles Davis and Andy Williams. Rock and roll was not a priority. So that song, even though it was number one in several markets like Portland, San Francisco, Hawaii, Seattle, some Louisiana cities, it charted very well there, but the distribution of the single was not there. So it didn't sell well, and the Kingsmen got the big hit with it. A self-titled album had been released on the prior label in late '63, early '64. It didn't chart, and the band was trying to get it together after the post-Louie Louie debacle when they lost out on that hit. And they added another guy named Mike Doc Holliday on bass and Drake Levin on guitar. The band released a self-titled album in late 1963, and I don't have that one, but what I do have is this is like a compilation of some of the earlier stuff, just called In the Beginning. It's got some kind of leftover 50s type of stuff like Don't Be Cruel, Shake, Rattle, and Roll, Mojo Workout, stuff like that. Now, around late 63, early 64, they started to wear these costumes. And it was just kind of a lark that they rented these from a shop. And they put them on in the second half of one of their shows, and the crowd went wild. And after they returned the costumes, following shows, people were saying, well, where are the costumes? You know, it was very popular, and by popular demand, they started to wear them all the time, and it became their trademark look. By 1964, the lineup started to solidify. So in addition to Paul Revere on organ and Mark Lindsay on vocals and sax, you had Mike Smith on drums, Drake Levin on guitar, and Mike Doc Holliday on bass. They started spending much more time at Columbia in Los Angeles and released a couple more singles. Their next Columbia single was called Louie Go Home, which was kind of a response to them losing out on the hit Louie Louie. Over You was their third Columbia single, and by this time they were starting to get a little bit of attention with these costumes, and they had this very energetic live show. And this was right during the British invasion, and the press started saying, well, Paul Revere and the Raiders are holding off the British invasion, and the press had fun with them, but the two songs you just heard still sounded pre-Beatles, really, and they were still kind of finding themselves musically in the studio. Now, during 1965, or late 64 rather, they started playing with bands like the Stones, and they played with the Stones for several shows on a couple of tours, and sometimes certain markets, the Raiders were more popular than the Stones, and they closed the show, and vice versa when the Stones went to a town where they were more popular. The Rolling Stones' first show in the LA area was at Long Beach, and the Raiders played with them there, and it was important because Dick Clark happened to be there, and he had just finished a pilot of like a weekly rock and roll show, and he saw the Raiders, and he thought that they may be a good addition to the show, and he signed them to the ABC show Where the Action Is.
There they are, Paul Revere and the Raiders. Look out! Yeah! In your mind, creating disturbance in your mind. Sometimes I cry when I'm blue.
Those two songs were the A and B side of their latest single on Columbia. It was their third single. Sometimes actually was the B side, and it charted at 131, which was not very high, but it did chart. And it was from their forthcoming album, Here They Come. Now this band really stabilized with Lindsay and Revere being the leaders of the band. Mike Smith was playing drums. We had Drake Levin on guitar, and Mike Holliday left and was replaced by Phil Volk on bass. Now Volk had played sessions. He was a music major in college, and he was going to be a valuable asset in the studio coming up very shortly here. Now one of the things the band did, this is their first Columbia album called Here They Come, and they really understood their image. So they had the costumes, they had the live show that was very energetic, and what Paul Revere wanted, he wanted every band member to have a nickname. So Paul was Uncle Paul, and Mark Lindsay was Madman Marcus, Mike Smith was Smitty, Phil Volk was Fang, and Drake Levin, the youngest of the band, was called the Kid. So they started to play off these on the TV show a lot, and they began to be known by their nicknames. Now this album was really their first proper album, and as you notice, it's called Paul Revere and the Raiders featuring Mark Lindsay. So from the very early time period, Mark Lindsay was featured on the title of the band. Now this album it's okay. The first side of the album is live, and the second side is studio. And it was produced by two different guys. Terry Melcher produced the studio side, and Bruce Johnston produced the live side. And they were both guys that were in the duo Bruce and Terry, and they were also the masterminds behind the ripcords.
Here's a thing called Louie Louie. Arms I ain't never gonna use. Believe in what my lips have to say. Give me fever.
This brings us to 1965, and the show Where the Action Is was a pretty big hit for them.
Don't lie to me. Have you been stepping on me? I got ways of finding out.
Steppin' Out became the first Columbia hit, and it hit number 46 in the States, but all the way up to number 8 in Canada. The TV show was really helping them out, and once they had the hit song, people went even crazier for the Raiders. And the thing that's important about this song is it was an original song written by Mark Lindsay and Paul Revere. For their next single, they tapped some writers from Longview, Washington, and it was Rick Day and Rich Brown of the Wild Knights, and this is the song Just Like Me. And this was a really great rock song, and at the time in 1965, there was very few songs on the top 40 that rocked harder than Just Like Me.
And I fall so much in love with you. It's just like me.
Just Like Me hit number 11, so they had their first big hit on Columbia. And the album that came out along with it is called Just Like Us. And they have both singles listed at the top here, and they have the television show listed as well, so they weren't taking any chances. Now, they do a lot of R&B covers on here, which are pretty good.
You're more than all right. You know you're out of sight. Why? You got a shape left. I'd be doggone if I wouldn't work all day. Baby, hear me cry.
They also do some covers on here that aren't so good, like Donovan's Catch the Wind. They do a version of the Stone Satisfaction, which isn't very good. The song Action is a pretty good example of what their sound was at this time. It was a little bit surfy, and they continued down this Beach Boy path with a car song called SS396, and this was a giveaway at the Chevrolet dealers.
Cruising the highway, I get my kicks. Everybody's digging my SS396. Yeah, the drought is the most. Go there, baby. We head for the course, way down by the coast. Go there, baby.
Their TV exposure really pushed the sales of these albums and the singles, and some of the other bands on Where the Action Is were bands like the Knickerbockers, Tommy Roe, the Robs, Keith Allison, and Linda Scott. But the Raiders stood out from all of them pretty much because they were so visual. Now, the next album was called Midnight Ride, and they ditched the R&B songs for more original material, and they sound like this. This was the second album I owned by Paul Revere and the Raiders, and I used to work at my grandparents' restaurant, and one of the waitresses knew I liked 60s music, and she gave me this record. And one of the things I really liked about this, not only are they writing more of their own material, but they've got a couple really good ballads, and they typically did not release ballads as singles, though they really could have.
So there are no words, just a melody for a girl.
Little girl, how can you know that my heart's full of pain? 'Cause I got to be leaving when the show...
The highlight of this album, of course, is Kicks, and this got to number 4 on the charts. And by the way, this album was released in 2 separate sleeves. Slight variation on the sleeve, I don't know why.
Don't it seem like kicks just keep getting harder to find, and all your kicks ain't bringing you peace of mind before you find out.
The next single after Kicks was going to be I'm Not Your Stepping Stone. Now, that was written by Boyce and Hart, later of the Monkees fame. And the reason why the Raiders didn't release it as a single is because Kicks was such a big single. That was written by Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil. So they wanted to follow that up, or at least Terry Melcher wanted to follow that up with another Mann and Weil song. And he got cold feet about Steppin' Stone, which was recorded 4 months before the Monkees version.
I'm not just stepping stone.
Their version of Steppin' Stone, I think, sounds just dirtier and grittier, and that probably would have been at least a moderate hit, but they do a great job of it. And by the way, these 2 album covers were both shot at Clark Gable's house, which apparently was in Brentwood Canyon. Now, the television exposure and the hit singles brought them even more TV work, and they got a gig on the TV show Batman for one episode. The next Man and Wheel song that was chosen was a song called Hungry, and this was also a big hit, getting to number 6.
I'm hungry for those good things, baby. Hungry through and through. I'm hungry.
This was late 1966, and music started changing drastically. The hippie culture and counterculture started to creep into the music, and the Raiders had recorded a separate version of this song that was originally unreleased.
With a penthouse in the sky, and we'll both stay stoned.
So I can't believe that song would have been released by the Raiders given their kind of squeaky clean image, but they recorded it and it came out, I think, on a bonus track on the CDs in the 90s. Now this is the next album, the forthcoming album, which is The Spirit of 67. This came out in late 1966. And Terry Melcher, the producer, got much more involved and he started doing some more songwriting. And the next single was called The Great Airplane Strike.
If I can't be here, I just might stay. And that 85 is going to be my home.
That song was inspired by a machinist union strike, and Terry Melcher wasn't really that high on that song. And the B-side was a song called In My Community, written by Phil Volk, and that potentially could have been the A-side, and that was put on the B-side instead.
In my community, in my community,
So you can hear the band's sound changing. You know, the saxophone disappeared, you know, the piano kind of went away, you brought in the organ. Drake Levin and Phil Volk started writing quality songs. So things started to really move a lot here for the band, and it seemed like they had a really great future and a lot of growth ahead of them. Although that one version of Hungry was not released, they did dip their toes in some mild psychedelia with these songs.
Oh, why is it so hard? Why? I would not tell what I did see.
So you can hear they're getting a little more progressive, they're getting a little more psychedelic here, and one song that they didn't record, or they tried to record and didn't complete it, was another Man and Wheel song called Long Way to Go. And this featured some exotic instruments like oud and electric violin and some others, but Lindsay was struggling with the vocals and apparently they didn't ever finish the song, but it's too bad. I would have loved to have heard that one. So Terry Melcher's presence on this album really brought the band to a higher level of recording, and he was pushing the band. And unfortunately, it looked like everything was going to go in a really excellent direction, but things started to unravel a bit. Drake Levin got drafted, and he joined the National Guard, and he was replaced by Jim Valley. So Jim Valley actually appears on the cover of this album, though he's not on the album, which is pretty much all Drake Levin. With this current batch of hits, they were really in high demand on the live circuit, so they started to tour more. And as such, this is the first time for this next album they started to bring in a couple of session guys. And Melcher brought in people that he knew. He brought in people like Bruce Johnston, Van Dyke Parks. Melcher himself appeared on some of the recordings. Jerry Cole and Hal Blaine played on a couple of songs as well. While they were touring and getting the new member, Jim Valley, whose nickname was Harpo, because he looked a little bit like Harpo from Marx Brothers, they released this Greatest Hits album. And there were two unique songs to this album.
And all you nations across the nation, I have had my ups and downs and all around.
This album, like the previous album, Spirit of 67, got to number 9, and this became one of their bigger sellers. And though it was selling like hotcakes, the band started to unravel. Jim Valley, who hadn't been with the band very long, he quit the band. He was promised that he could use some of his songs on the albums, and that was not happening. So he left the band. And to fill the gap, Drake Levin, who could play a little bit on weekends when he was on leave from the National Guard, he came back to the band and filled in. But that didn't last long either, because the three members, Phil Volk, Levin, and Mike Smith, they all left at this point because they wanted a little bit more involvement on the albums. So the three guys, Levin, Smith, and Volk, they wanted to be more part of the creative process like they had been earlier. And some of these session players that came in, they could kind of see the writing on the wall. The money was big on the road, so they were getting edged out a little bit, and the focus was on Mark Lindsay. And him and Melcher were basically doing a lot of the co-writing together, so the balance of power shifted to Terry Melcher and Mark Lindsay. Through all this, Smith, Volk, and Levin did play on the next album, Revolution. They played quite a lot on this album, although with the transition of new members, there were some session guys in as well. Now the new members were Joe Carrero Jr. on drums, session player Freddie Weller on guitar, and Charlie Coe, who had played guitar with them in an early version of the band, rejoined on bass. Now with the I Had a Dream single, the backside of the sleeve features just Mark Lindsay. And with all this going on, Melcher brought in some session guys, some names you would recognize.
When I touch your hand, don't you
So on Wanting You, Ry Cooder plays on that song, and the song Upon Your Leaving, it sounds like a Beach Boys Wrecking Crew song. So that's got session players on, as you can tell. And but the thing is, without Volk, Levin, and Smitty, they seemed to lost their edge. They didn't have that hard driving rock sound anymore, and it got replaced by the smoothed over studio sound.
You can look every place, but you won't see my face. You can search everywhere.
Now this album has got its fair share of weak songs, but there are also two pretty good psych songs too, if you like psychedelic music.
If you let me out, you try, you will find your light bright. My love has gone behind the hill. She says that if I hurry, I can catch her still.
After 3 top 10 albums in a row, this album stalled at number 25. And there was a lot more competition in 1967. You had the Doors, you had the Monkees, you had the Buckinghams, and all this was taking a little market share away from bands like the Raiders. And even Drake Levin released his own single.
I know she's gonna cry if I try to say goodbye. I'll just slip away, go away, let love die, die. Hit the road to Mexico. Come train, go, come get you, gonna come get you, gonna come and take you all the way.
Where the Action Is was canceled at the end of the year, and the band started to concentrate on their next project. Now by this point, they were outselling the Byrds as Columbia's largest rock band. With FM radio coming, the Raiders had to make a decision here, well, which direction are we going to go? In the interim, they did a Christmas album, this one called A Christmas Present and Past. Now it wasn't unusual for bands to do Christmas albums in the 60s, and it was unusual to do one this badly. This album was received so poorly that the single that was supposed to be released, called Rain, Sleet, Snow, was canceled. And though it's not easy coming up with new Christmas songs, this effort came out as very sophomoric, and they were relying on anti-war sentiment, and it just didn't really work at all. So this album is as un-Christmassy as it gets, and Melcher maybe was so embarrassed, he left. He parted company with the Raiders at this point, and that was the end of the partnership. And this album actually charted at number 71, which is low for a normal album, but I'm kind of surprised it got that high, as bad as it is. And the momentum that they had from all the hits was going to change in 1968, and we're going to cover that in part 2. Here on Pop Goes the 60s.